time and place in regards to climate change. So it looks like I need to say that I got it. I got it. We're recording. And then finally on St. Francis Day, the 10th of October, we'll have some more time for a group discussion. I hope to be with you in person at that point, definitely, and think about what it might mean to integrate some of the things that we've learned through this series in our own common life at Epiphany. So that's kind of the schedule before us. And then I also want to call your attention to two special events coming up as well, which is on the 25th from 3 to 5 p.m. Our annual river cleanup with the Ismaili community will be at Clyde Shepherd Nature Preserve and also Mason Mill Park this year. More information about how to sign up is in your newsletter. And then I also want you to know that on the 16th of October, there will be a keynote with the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley and an interfaith panel discussion and call to action really in our city. And that will be hosted at Science Gallery Atlanta from 3 to 5 p.m. This panel has been one that I and others in our church have been collaborating on with a bunch of religious faith leaders to really come together as a faith community to talk about the issues of climate change specific to the state of Georgia and how it might look like to respond as communities of faith together. So I hope that you will mark your calendars and come out for that. Take a drink of water here real quick. So I want to start this morning by just bringing us to scripture. As Christians, this is a good place for us to start. The series is called Listening to the Voice of Creation. And Psalm 19, which was in your newsletter article today, says, "The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork." So we get this idea from most of our sacred texts that creation is speaking to us about God and about God's works. So we know something about the nature of God through the voice of creation. The prophets are alive with these kinds of statements. In Nehemiah, here's one we read as Ezra the prophet proclaims, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made the heavens. You have made the heaven and the heavens of heavens with all their host, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them. To all of them, you give life, and the host of heaven worships you." So this idea of God as creator and this idea of creation as responding to God, God's creative power, the heavens are worshiping, the heavens are speaking. They have something to say about who God is and what God's work is in the world. Even in the New Testament, here in Romans, we hear, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." Basically, if you're paying attention to the created world, God is alive and present, and obviously so. The writer in Romans here says that people are without excuse because of the way that all of the world is revealing God's glory. And of course, I'm sure you might think of other ways, just popcorn style. What are some other ways that you hear the voice of creation in the testimony of Scripture? Either as animals are singing God's praises, or the seas are alive with the power of God. Talk to me. Just throw them a little bit out there, popcorn style, if you will. Here's some pictures to help you. What do you see here?
The burning bush.
The burning bush. God came to Moses in a burning bush. What else do you see here?
Jonah and the whale of the fish.
That's right. That's right. Even the seas and the creatures of the seas responding to the voice of God.
Balaam's donkey.
Balaam's donkey.
That's the night
The ravens feeding Elijah. Yeah, there are many examples, and I'm sure you can think of more as we go on. But I want us to just take a minute before we do go on And I want you to break up into groups of 3 or 4, just people who are sort of around you at your tables, and ask one another, how are environmental issues a matter for Christian life and faith? Why should we pay attention to creation? What is going on in creation? How is that a matter for Christian life and faith? So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to kind of get those reels going and come up with some ideas here.
What size groups do you suggest? Maybe 3 or 4 units. I think she's what it's taken to really play like
the last one is
that's a great.
All right, I hear some really good indistinct chatter, but I'm going to give you 1 more minute to sum up your comments. 1 more minute. Okay, well now it's your time to share your wisdom with me and with the larger group. And if Paul or Amy or someone in the room can help with this piece, just do a little report back. What are just a couple of things as you discussed with your group mates there that came to the surface for you as you discussed this question?
Anybody want to start? Something from your group, some content?
We're arguing over who's gonna be our person.
I'll go raise her hand and say, please me.
No, I didn't. We talked about somewhat about caring for ourselves in terms of caring for the creation. I mean, of the earth. In terms of, I said that, and I talk about people caring for themselves, to keep themselves healthy and things like that, which is part of this, because we talk about the trees and the flowers, the birds, and we're part of God's creation also. So I think it's really important. That was one thing. And the other one was the people that come after us, our children, our grandchildren. What are we leaving down into that?
And the people right now who are suffering, you know.
Right.
Talking
Yeah.
about, you know,
So in addition to not being all that great about taking care and being good stewards of creation, we're not even good stewards of each other. Oftentimes. Stewardship came up in our group too, where we felt like, God has just turned this amazing thing over to us, and we have tremendous power over it in a way that other created beings may not. And we have a responsibility to use our power. We have tremendous powers for destruction, but also powers to sustain what we've been given. Right. So, anything else in our group that you guys? So stewardship, you said stewardship.
and also just our role in adding to creation.
Oh, our sort
Yeah,
of the
the-
co-creators
yeah.
that we even were sort of co-creators. I mean, we can't create anything as beautiful and as intricate as even a leaf, but we are creative, expressive beings like God is a creative being. Who else?
Scripturally, Jesus is the firstborn of new creation, come to bring us a new heaven and a new earth. That is the goal of Christ coming to earth. So it's sort of central. Would be my response. People love Christians around the world, not particularly me, love to quote John 3:16 and say that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Right? It says cosmos. God so loved the creation. So it doesn't. That's where that text is going.
And because God loves the creation, we should also love the creation.
We
It is the only thing that we know.
no, we were.
It is intended to be eternal.
I heard Catherine quote. I used to say to people all the time, God's original plan was to hang out in the garden with two naked vegetarians. And I think you can take scripture from the beginning to the end, and if you make creation a character in it, instead of just thinking about the relationship between God and people.
Right.
So much of our theology is focused on the relationship between God and people. We are part of the creation, so it's a relationship between God and God's creation, and how we fit into that. And I think even our theology is exceptional and excludes creation too long.
That doesn't give creation a voice. It only gives us a kind of
Or a purpose.
domination.
Yeah, or a purpose. Yeah.
Who else? You might.
I would go here. We're kind of echoing what Barbara said. Just if you love your friends, your neighbors, and maybe the whole world, then that's what they live in. So that's a big responsibility to care for it enough to let people live in a beautiful place. One of, a place where they can thrive.
Right.
And so much of the degradation of the world, you know, us including, you know, like, but I'm not gonna go to negative, but you know,
Right. Yeah, so honoring creation honors, in honoring creation, we honor each other because we all depend on it. And we got into that with sort of future generations, yeah. That we need sustainability so that future generations can enjoy what God has given to us. Are you getting this, Amy? Or Amy, not Amy. Nicole. Amy is sitting right here. You look so much like Amy.
Muted, Nicole.
You're muted, Nicole.
More or less I am. Yeah, I am getting it. And I'm gonna change over my slide here and tell you kind of some things that I think that are not too dissimilar from what you think. But I want to make 3 points this morning about why I think environmental issues and especially the task of ecological contemplation is an important part of our faith. First, I want to say that creation is a site of divine revelation. It discloses God as creator, God as the being who is holding life together. But I think it also discloses, and I think that this was pretty salient in a lot of the comments that you all made, it discloses the interconnectedness of all of life. So someone who spends time in creation is going to make the connections between the life of the tree and the plants and the health of the bird, right? All of those systems, ecological systems, are working together really to support the interconnectedness of all life. And so because of this, I also want to say that creation is a site both of grace and human responsibility. So it is a gift that we are given by God that helps us to know about who God is, the nature of God, but also who it is that we are as human beings, dependent upon God, dependent upon other created beings to live and to move and to have our being. And with that gift, though, I think, and you all said this pretty well in the comments that I heard, is that there is a responsibility then to steward and to care mutually for the gifts that we have been given. And I don't know, I mean, you tell me, I don't know if we can really know and understand the depth of the gift that we have in creation without paying attention, which is why I think this task of contemplation is really, really important for the walk of faith in regards to ecological concerns and the issues that we're facing today. So I want to ask if there's, I hope you can't hear that siren that is coming down my street.
Nope.
Can't hear it?
No.
Oh, good, because I can't. But I just want you to talk back to me a little bit about those 2 points that I made there. Creation is a site of divine revelation, and as such, it is a site of grace and also of human responsibility.
Yeah,
Any questions that brings up?
one of the things our group mentioned was like nature is one of the few things that almost everybody sees as like being like transcendental or being something where you feel the presence of the divine.
That's right. Absolutely. It's something we all share. There's no escaping it.
Though we try.
Though we try. Okay, well, let's move on then. So I want to talk just a little bit more about this idea of ecological contemplation. As I said before, it's a way of paying attention to God and to the nature of relationships between living things. One of the things that I think acts of contemplation also do for us is that they challenge this idea of human exceptionalism, that humans are at the center of the universe and that the universe was made to support human life and well-being. that the world is something that we live in to extrapolate for our own resources and our own profit. The other day, I bought an article, a garment from Athleta, which is a popular brand for one of my children. And on the card, y'all, I'm not joking, on the card it said, "We value people and the planet along with profit." I was like, wow, Athleta, y'all are really trying. You're really trying to appeal to my ecological, concern, and yet failing miserably. We have a long history that we all know, right? That humans are really good at thinking about resources for their own consumption, the value that they have to sort of support their own life. And the human propensity for greed, and I think that paying attention to creation, to really being out in the elements, to being alongside animals and the dirt, we begin to that sort of idea that the world was made for us gets challenged a little bit, and we begin to see ourselves as part of a bigger system of relationship and a bigger system of creation. And in that, I think that it elevates this mystery, which was that Jeremy who talked about I can't really see, but maybe it was. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Was it?
Yeah.
Right. But it elevates this idea of mystery, of there being something that holds us together in a way that is beyond anyone's understanding, and therefore then fosters a sense of humility. Poets are always good, I think, when I think about folks who really excel at ecological contemplation. I think most often about farmers, and I think most often about poets. And I'm sure you all are familiar with Mary Oliver's poems, but I'd love it if somebody would just read this for us.
It's really small.
Is it very small?
We got it.
Should I read it?
Yes.
All right, I'll read it. This is a popular poem by Mary Oliver, but she writes, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things." How many of you have heard that before? Talk to me a little bit, if you're familiar with it, about the paradox Oliver is uplifting here, where she begins this poem saying, you don't have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. And then ends how creation is announcing your place in the family of things. If she was speaking to a spiritual idea here, and using really the voice of creation, what is she talking about? What spiritual themes do you see in this poem? It might be too small for you to see. And I'm sorry about that.
And she's talking about salvation. I think she's talking about all the work we try to do and all the ways we go, all the steps we go through, all of the right words and right ways of doing things that we worry about, whether we're Episcopalians or evangelicals looking for an altar call. I think what she's saying is I think what she's saying is that the gospel says we are already free. We just have to let ourselves be part of it. That the place of freedom is in the world. That salvation happens here in these bodies on this earth.
The other thing I would say, because I heard this poem in yoga classes. And it talks about presence, that just pay attention. You're not alone, and there's a lot of grace in the world.
I think the line, meanwhile, the world goes on is important. The world goes on, the geese fly home again. No matter what you have going on in your brain, and observing all of these things kind of it creates in me anyway just a deep sense of peace, being out in nature, alone in nature, maybe more than even being with humans in nature.
Yes. Yes to all of that. Yeah, I want you to hold those themes, those spiritual themes that Oliver is bringing to our attention in this poem. So I also, the third point that I want to bring though, about ecological contemplation, thinking about these themes of salvation and presence, and humility. I think that ecological contemplation also discloses how the spiritual and spiritual brokenness among people and the land correlate with the contemporary human's broken relationship with creation. And here's a spiritual leader, Pope Francis, who says, just to bring this point home, that the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. He says we cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to the causes related to human and social degradation. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. The impact of the present imbalances is so seen in the premature death of many of the world's poor. These kinds of comics are all over right now, right? In contrast to Mary Oliver's beautiful, hopeful poem, we also are bombarded by images like this, where we are seeing signs that are causing us stress. Here's these two people reading about reading various kinds of reports, and there's sweat coming off of their heads, and their eyebrows are downturned. And then we see charts like this where, it doesn't look hopeful. It doesn't look hopeful, where the global temperatures in our society are warmer than they've ever been. And you all read about this every day. And yet we then get to James Gus Speth, who's a former dean of the Yale School of Forestry and U.S. presidential climate advisor, who then tells us this. He says, I used to think that if we threw enough good science at the environmental problems, we could solve them. I was wrong. The main threats to the environment are not biodiversity loss or pollution and climate change, as I once thought. They are selfishness and greed and pride. And for that, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, something we scientists don't know much about. How does that sit with you all?
So it's not just a scientific problem, it's a theological problem.
It's a human problem. It's a cultural problem.
It seems just as hopeless as the other message. I think that we can somehow deal with selfishness, greed, and pride. I don't know. They're kind of eternal and universal.
I didn't quite get that last comment. Can someone summarize for me?
It just seems like thinking that the problem is selfishness, greed, and pride puts us in the same place as we were before, which is desperate. Because we can't make anybody not selfish. We can't make anybody less greedy. And that's,
But we can make ourselves, we can make ourselves loving and sacrificial and humble. So we don't need to necessarily make others that way. We just make ourselves that. But people are watching what the church does matters.
And I think part of that comes from the brokenness of the relationship, you know, with people in creation, you know, because when you connect, you know, you care a lot more about seeing something bad happen to someone you care about necessarily than like a stranger on the news, right? And it doesn't mean we don't care. I guess what I'm trying to say is the more we are connected to creation, the more we are engaged in spending time with creation, I think you can't help but transform ourselves, right? And then that's where it becomes easier, I think. Easier is not really the right word, but you feel, you know, just that it's easier to do the right thing for the environment when we are connected with creation, which is something I have a lot of. So I'm not, you know, speaking from a place of, hey, I've figured it out, but, and I don't know that I'm expressing myself very well right now, but I just think that that's, you know, part of, you know, like John said, it has to start with our own, you know, our own actions.
In the same way that we can repair our relationships with each other and not use each other or look at each other just as resources to be used up, we can do the same with the planet. I think that's one of the points that's being made here. I mean, before labor laws, for example, companies just used people up.
Companies
still do.
Yeah, I mean, disaster capitalism can profit from, you know, the destruction of biodiversity and, you know, negative changes to the climate. And I find it very interesting too that he's like, that scientists who've expended like no lack of endeavor or no lack of effort to remove any kind of spiritual discussions from the public sphere are now maybe kind of realizing that you're, you know, simply explaining that bad things are going to happen if that the temperature is not going to actually make anything happen.
And there are even some people that look at this as kind of the ultimate opportunity for profit to solve it. I think maybe that's kind of what you were. I don't think that's the right reason, but
Well, and
it is a motivation.
that quote also, I feel like we keep having this sort of imaginary juxtaposition between science and faith, right? Like we, you know, and so even this is saying, well, scientists don't know much about spiritual and cultural transformation. Well, why not? I mean, you know, a scientist is a human, you know, like, I know, I understand the point that he is making here. But I also feel like, yeah, I think, you know, there's sort of, I'm really not trying to say it, but I know, like, for me, the more I learn about the science behind some of the things in creation and nature, the more absolutely enthralled I am, the more it seems like a miracle. You know, like I could spend hours contemplating like how a monarch butterfly changes in the cocoon. It's wild. I mean, it goes from having a proboscis, which is like a straw. I mean, it goes from an animal that has teeth and chews leaves to turning into an animal that like eats in a completely different way. I mean, it's amazing. It's a miracle. And so I don't think that like we have to separate that faith and that science, you know, and I think it does, I think we need both. You know, I think we need that spiritual transformation and we need, you know, we can use science to connect with nature.
I think one of the things that this guy is saying is that don't count on there being a scientific solution.
Right, yes, I know that.
That it is a behavior.
That's
it is a
right.
behavior and motivational.
That's right. He is expressing a limitation to scientific intervention. And
Right.
what then is what desire then does he still have though? Where is he? I'm sorry.
It would be nice to continue to have something for him to study, you know.
This is the guy who's.
What is he hoping for is our salvation. He's hoping for that there is still some kind of salvific thing that can happen, right? There's a limitation to scientific intervention. And what is his hope?
Spiritual and cultural transformation.
Spiritual and cultural transformation. This might be something that the church may know something about. He's hoping for ecological conversion. And this goes back to the point we made earlier with Mary Oliver's poem, right? Willis Jenkins, who's at UVA, who wrote a really important book called Ecologies of Grace, talks about that when we engage Christian environmental strategies for ecological restoration or the hope thereof, we're often relying heavily on traditions of salvation. We are hoping that there is something that can save us, that can restore us, that can heal us. And we just heard from a science expert about his understanding of the limitations of science to save us, which, back to Kate's point, does not mean that those technological interventions are not important, but they are limited. So if they are limited, what else is there to put our hope in?
It's not just that they're limited, but it's like I just read an article about where to invest for the future, since like our coastal lines are going to be essentially useless because they'll be underwater, right? So where do you want to buy property? You want to buy property in places that aren't going to heat up as much. So we can use science to find out what parts of the country or what parts of the world won't heat up as much, and then billionaires can buy those up and make a lot of money in the future, and everybody has to migrate there, right? So science is certainly useful in that sense, but it's not doing anything positive.
But it's not what?
Doing anything positive, right? It's just fueling more profits, right? People who already have a lot of money. So he's looking for, obviously we have to be able to take this knowledge and have a change where we stop relying on profits as the sole end game, right? And value other people and the environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, call this phrase traditions of salvation reminds me of a quote from the author of the book that we read, I think, last year in one of our groups, where some eco theologian had said that we won't save, we'll only save what we love. And so the reason to save any of this is that we love it. It's this great gift.
All of you, it's concerning me because the traditions of salvation comes from God. And so we're, and
Oh, God, man.
I have a friend. And so, but we'll talk about it sometime. But the traditions of salvation is imposed. We're back to the creator. I mean, in this big conversation today, we're back to the creator, and it's God who created all of us and all of this, whatever, all of it. And therefore, it's going back to God. It's going back to how we look at God, and we may all look at it differently, but it's like you say about the miracles in nature, or the miracles in the sheep that get out there, but I want them back, that take care of our environment in another way. And that we're all together on that we're all involved because we care, because we're God's creation, because we come from God, and because we're in this church that's something about God.
Well, I think the part about the cultural changes, when we think of Christmas and all of the presents and buying decorations and, I mean, for years, people talk about, all my life, people have talked about the commercialization of Christmas. It's just sort of having less stuff and driving your car longer or driving your car less. Just the things that people can do that just our whole culture is telling us to not do. You want more, you want, nicer clothes, you have to have the latest color or whatever.
Right, that sin of greed and self-centeredness is real.
Right. I think the whole problem is rooted in sin, in greed. Well, and when I say sin, I pretty much mean greed. Just because of all the systems that all the investment that we have in continuing to put the kind of carbon into the environment that, there's just a ton of people that are invested in that. And that's where we are.
So I'm aware that we're getting close to time, so I want to move on just a little bit. I'm really hopeful that we can think as we go along these next 2 weeks, where Hannah and Gayla are going to be with us, talking to us about actions, about how people have in the state of Georgia are organizing to respond to the ecological crisis. And as we go along and listening to them, I'm really hopeful that we can carry in this idea of what kind of tradition of salvation are these narratives we're going to hear articulating, right? And I want to say, back to Barbara's point, that first off, if we're going to think about conversion, we've got to also be thinking about grace. Conversion is a grace of the Holy Spirit that is not fully dependent upon our own actions. And yet, so much of our tradition is based on the question of how we might orient ourselves to this grace of God, especially made known to us in Jesus Christ. And from reading scripture and from hearing probably the people on either side of you who are going to be inclined to different kinds of working out of their own salvation, that even the biblical witness isn't consistent on this idea of salvation and how we participate in God's salvation. And let's just look at these real quick, because I think it's fascinating. In Ephesians, we hear, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves. It is a gift of God, not by works, so no one can boast. For by grace you've been saved through faith." Oh, I have it on there twice. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Then in James, but someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Faith apart from works is dead." Philippians, "Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but so much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for God's good pleasure." So here we have Ephesians who's saying, it's all God. Grace, it's all God. James, who's uplifting, well, you have to respond to God's grace through works, otherwise it's dead. And Philippians, who's sort of paradoxically combining these two ideas. But I put these before you because I think a lot of times when we move to in any kind of really issue of social justice, what is at the heart of the matter theologically is us trying to figure out how we can participate with God's grace, with God's own agency for the sake of our own well-being, our collective well-being. So it's not, I think, back to what the scientist said, it's not all going to be solved by our own works, by our own technical interventions. And yet we have to participate with God in the act of restoring creation. So we're not going to have time for that. But I do, and I'm not in the room, so I'm not really sure how this is landing. So talk back to me when we think about the sort of problem of the ecological crisis before us. Does it make sense what I'm saying about the traditions and salvation of the church being a lens through which we can think about our own action orientations and postures to partner with God for restoration?
I guess where I'm a little bit confused is that I'm hearing, well, we don't have to worry about it because God's going to save it. And I think God will let the human race die out, or because of our actions.
Well, in a way, everything that happens is the result of God. I mean, I'm not sure I would say, human agency is always God at work. I mean, God desires certain things. It would seem to me that's part of our tradition. And I just think that when we weep at the destruction of the environment, God is weeping too. But absolutely, I mean, we can pray that God moves humans to behave differently, to see, we were talking about seeing, to see what's happening.
I think that, our faith is centered on following the teachings of a man who turned everything upside down. Like he came into the world, and everything he did was about the outsider, and everything he did was about, just like completely flipping the narrative, right? From those who had the power, right? And he was saying, no, it's blessed be, the ones who don't have the power, who don't have the money, who don't have the authority, all of those things. And so I think, we have a faith of resurrection and restoration, that like, even when we are in despair, there is hope, right? That's part of Christianity. And that even when you think you're at the end, right, you find the empty tomb. And so I think there's hope in that for us, but we have to be willing to follow Jesus, which is not easy. I mean, it's not about comfort. It's not about, physical comfort or emotional comfort either. No, it's about flipping ourselves upside down so that we're following Jesus, which means taking away everything that's kind of being fed into us by our culture and instead trying to live our lives through that model.
if the vocation of the church is to bring about God's plan for the earth, then it makes perfect sense that this would be part of that plan, part of the vocation of the church.
I don't know that I believe that God has a plan. I believe he just, the Big Bang theory, Big Bang happened and whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And that, I hear, other people say, well, God meant for this to happen. Like, how do you know? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's like there are, however many billion planets that maybe there is some other planet that's going, oh, wow, I don't need that new pair of sneakers. Everybody goes, yeah, right. Everyone grows their own vegetables or something. I don't know.
I don't know if it's going to come out from my mouth once we go into my head the right way, but I keep thinking back to the poem, but also the concept of selfishness and greed. And I feel like humanity is not going to get past this without realizing that part of the selfishness is putting ourselves outside of creation. That we are a part of creation whether we want to be it or not. And until we can recognize that, we won't do anything.
Nicole, if we're gonna quote scripture.
Always, Barbara, always.
I have come to give life and to give it more abundant. I mean, I feel like that's pervasive in the scriptures that we have, but that God is the God of abundance and not scarcity. And therefore, if I believe that, I gotta do my part in looking at that there is abundance to be had, but there has to be abundance for everybody. And I work I have to work on that too, because I'm part of the culture. I mean, I'm culture. So, but it's up to me to be aware, not so much of what you're doing, but what I'm doing or not doing. Because it's not up to me to fix anybody myself. In the house. And I'm not about fixing other people. It's mindset. So I think
I would always just say too, that there's always hope. And I think that's some of what you were saying, Kate, that there's always hope. I mean, the next moment will be different than this moment. So rather than us getting so bogged down in the enormity of all of this, I think the challenge might be to find hope.
Well, I am aware that we are definitely past time. I want to just touch back in on Lisa Daly's comment that said, I don't have much hope. I mean, I think that the world may be ending, that this might be the end of the human race, that we are in a time of experiencing what some people would want to say, the ramifications of our own actions. In some ways, God is letting us suffer the poor decisions that we've made throughout history. And to that, I want to say, I mean, the science is there that we are living through an ending, that the world as it was is dying away, and that there is real grief and pain that we're experiencing about that. But that I also want to hold this tension about knowing too that we serve a God of resurrection. And so what does it mean that even in the midst of the hell that Jesus descended into and really died, that there was more to receive, there was more life to receive, even in that death. And so what is the process of us opening ourselves up to receive the gift of that life, even in the midst of the deaths that we are experiencing around us? And there are species who are dying off left and right now. And so I wonder, how our ecological contemplation, or how our contemplation of God, therefore, really opens us up to receive life even in the midst of death. Well, I know that it is time, and so I send you off and look forward to being with you next week as we continue the conversation together. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. You know how to find me over phone or over email. I hope to get back to you very soon, but blessings on your Sunday.
Thank you.